How that transition would take place, I wish I had a crystal ball, I could say. But I don't see one thing. How could a government, after employing so much brute force and depending on this brute force, can sustain for a long time?
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Bangladesh is roiled in the most intense protests and domestic upheaval in decades. The protests began peacefully by students objecting to a quota system for government jobs. In this system, government jobs are mostly reserved for those who fought in the 1971 War for Independence and their descendants. That quota system was in place for years, then it was substantially revoked, only to be reinstated by Bangladesh's High Court in June. This sparked protests, which turned violent when a pro-government student group attacked the peaceful protesters. The government of Sheikh Hasina has since enacted a brutal crackdown, imposing curfews, blocking the internet, and authorizing security forces to shoot on sight anyone breaking curfew. This crackdown by Sheikh Hasina is the latest example of her turn to authoritarianism, a trend that has been accelerating in recent years. My guest today, Ali Riaz, is a distinguished professor at the Department of Politics and Government at Illinois State University and the president of the American Institute of Bangladesh Studies. We kick off discussing the quota system and the genesis of these protests before having a long conversation about how economic stagnation after a period of rapid growth, combined with corruption and an authoritarian turn, has created the volatile situation we see in Bangladesh today. Before we begin, however, I wanted to share with you an update from an episode I published earlier this week about Alsu Kurmasheva. She is a Russian-born, naturalized American citizen who works for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. She mostly covers cultural stories for the Tatar language service of RFERL. Last year, she traveled to Russia to visit her elderly mother, and on her way home, she was detained at the airport and had her passport confiscated. She was later sent to prison, denied consular access, and more or less held incommunicado. I published that episode on Monday, which featured an interview with her husband, Pavel Butorin, also a journalist for Radio Free Europe. However, just hours after I published the interview, it was reported that Alsu was sentenced, and she was sentenced to more than 6 years in prison on the spurious charge of spreading falsehoods about the Russian military. This is a deeply concerning story for those of us who care about press freedom. I write more about this development on globaldispatches.org, and I would encourage you to follow the link in the show notes to see my update, which includes a personal effort to get the White House more engaged in this case. And I will continue to follow and share with you updates about the status of Alsu Kurmasheva, a wrongfully detained American in jail, in prison, in Russia, for the crime of being an American journalist. And lastly, please do support our efforts. We depend on a degree of listener support to keep this show going. Please visit globaldispatches.org to get a paid subscription to Global Dispatches, which also unlocks all episodes of our new podcast about the UN, To Save Us from Hell. You will help us keep the lights on, and we certainly appreciate it. Thank you. Now here is my conversation with Ali Riaz, a professor at Illinois State University. Ali, just to kick off, can I have you just explain what this quota system is and where it comes from?
Bangladesh became independent in 1971, and soon after, then government decided to have some quotas precisely for those who participated in the War of Independence in 1971. In 72, when the quota system started, it was huge. About 80% of them were decided at that point should be reserved, including, and then there are other categories of people who've been added to it, such as women and indigenous community, and so on and so forth. But it changed. Over time, it started to change. And currently, where we stand, it actually started in 2018. This episode, in a sense, because by then, over time, with these changes made by the government in public service, 56% of the government jobs were reserved for various sections of people. Now, when I say various sections of people, 30% of those were kept for those who participated in the war and their children. Then it was changed later in 2010 to add the grandchildren, so second and third generation. So 30% of the quota of the jobs, all the jobs, 30% would go to those. Now, here we see that the war took place in 71, and we are talking about 2010, right? So it has been a long time. So this idea was that the descendants of the freedom fighters should have some priority over others. But there are others too. Say, for example, 10% of the quota was for women, 10% of for the people coming from what they described as underdeveloped districts, and then indigenous communities, the 5%, and those who are, I would call, differently abled people for them. So this is what it was. In 2018, there was a student movement. They demanded that it should be reformed. Not only saying the 30% issue or 5%, they said overall this should be reformed. Why? Because if you look at 56%, that means only 44% is based on merit, right?
Yeah, like the overwhelming number of people that are able to get government jobs, which presumably is like the path to the middle class or a secure middle class livelihood in Bangladesh, are reserved for this quota system. And of those in the quota system, the kind of plurality goes to the descendants of those who fought in the War of Independence.
Right. And that is what prompted the situation that, okay, they started demanding the reform. Government initially denied, oh, no, we're not going to do it. And of course, those who were on the streets, the students were agitating at that point, students only. There was nobody else was with them because they were fighting for their jobs, basically their future. So government initially denied, and then the government supporters, the student wing of the ruling Awami League, actually went after them, and the leaders of that movement were arrested, and so on and so forth. Those are the kind of situation that was happening. But at that point, suddenly, out of this whole thing, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina on the parliament declared that she's abolishing the entire quota system.
So presumably she bowed to that political pressure, but I know there's a caveat here, so go on.
Right. I mean, she bowed to the pressure, but she actually didn't accept the rationale. She did it out of annoyance, which she acknowledged lately in 2024. She acknowledged that it was not an informed decision. It was annoyance. She was pretty much annoyed. And subsequently, government did issue a circular, as they call it, saying that, okay, quota system is gone. Later, years later, 7 descendants of the freedom fighters went to the High Court and challenged that. High Court came up with a ruling this June that says the government's decision to scrap the quota system is null and void. The High Court's argument was that it is discriminatory, it is not supporting an affirmative action part of it. Blah. There were some arguments. Students didn't like it for understandable reason. They said, no, this needs to be changed. Government took it to the appellate division of the High Court that they're appealing against this. But the students were on the street. Their demand was reform it, and reform it through conversation. Let's come to the table. Let's decide what is best. One of the reasons that has galvanized the students, this quota was used and abused. Quota became a pathway for those who are close to the ruling party. They were benefiting out of it. So it was seen as a discriminatory. So in July, the students started the agitation in the sense of peaceful, very peaceful demonstration. They would sit on the street, mostly on the campuses, and they tried to go to the government offices, to the education ministry, to the public service commission, and eventually to the president's residence, and demanded that this needs to be rescinded, this high court needs to be challenged. And they were demanding that the executive branch and legislative branch come up with a solution rather than the court.
Which seems reasonable because it was the court that just a month ago reversed in the ending of the quota system and reinstated it, much to the chagrin of these students who presumably want to be able to compete for these government jobs. So the students, as you noted, were engaged in the peaceful petition of those in power and peaceful protests and seeking accommodation. But I take it the government responded rather harshly. What's transpired over these last few days that has made this just such a volatile and, to be honest, dangerous moment in Bangladesh?
It transformed into something, and there are two things that started simultaneously. What happened is, first, when the students were demanding, Prime Minister made some remarks and likened these students with collaborators of 1971. The phrase that she used, Rajakar, which is actually means those who collaborated with Pakistanis. And her point was that if this quota is not preserved for the descendants of the freedom fighters, should we keep it for those who actually collaborated? So the students, it was an affront to them.
Yeah, I mean, this is really like volatile language that
Right.
Sheikh Hasina used, basically calling these student protesters, like the equivalent in American context of like a terrorist or enemies of the state.
Absolutely. And soon after that, the student wing of the Awami League, the ruling party, went after these students, beaten them, and tried to drive them out. And students responded that, okay, we are going to have public demonstration. So they called for public demonstration and they called for general strike at one point. That became the moment of transformation. Students were not aligning with any political party. Up until that, no political party actually came forward, including the opposition, didn't even bother to comment about it. At best, lip service, once in a while, as a passing remark, oh yeah, we do support them. But essentially, when they called the general strike, that is the moment it transformed in the sense that public, mostly younger population, joined them, and the police and the government forces responded heavy-handedly. Heavy-handed is an understatement. In a single day, 6 students were killed on the streets in various parts of the country. That is what the transformation moment. And then that brought thousands of people on the street on the next day. Why? Because that is where it transformed without the leadership of the opposition. Because there is this enormous discontent simmering over the years among the population. Sources of discontent first is economic. Despite the claim of the government that Bangladesh has been doing extremely well in terms of GDP growth and so on and so forth, some of those figures are not exactly right. I mean, there's a quota.
Well, really, I was going to ask you about that because, I was in Bangladesh and in Dhaka and Chittagong. It must have been like 2011 or 2010, which, was in retrospect at the start of this period of like really extremely rapid economic growth. Like I was just looking at some of the GDP figures and, when I was there in 2010, it was about $800 gross domestic product per capita. Today, it's like over 2,600, I guess, if you believe those numbers. At least in 2022, it was around those numbers. So the idea, it's been like almost tripled. It has been just like this remarkably fast growing economy over the last 15 years. But now it seems that the economy has stalled, and that, at least to a point, has to be the source of these students' frustrations.
Right, students are more so for the public. The students' point was that, look, if there is so much economic growth, why there is not job? Why the employment? Why this high unemployment? I mean, you'd be surprised to know that roughly 39-40% of younger population between 15 and 25, 26, 39% of them are neither at school nor at job. If you take the youth unemployment, it is roughly about 14%, as opposed to what the government claims about 3-4% unemployment. So students' dissatisfaction was that, okay, fine, there is economic growth. Where's my share? Why don't I get a job? I'm not asking for a piece of cake. I'm asking for my job. We know where did this money go. Where did it go? Because of the corruption. Endemic corruption is an understatement. And this corruption is by those who are close to the regime. So the beneficiary of this growth, whatever that is, some of them are made up, but there are significant growth that has been contributed by the ready-made garment sector, by the remittances, and other people who are contributing to the economy. But the government is squandering all these things because A, this is being taken off, and most of it are being siphoned off at the capital flight outside the country. So a small group of people are benefiting out of it. So price hike is one thing that we have seen since summer of 2022. Government blames the COVID, government blames the Ukraine war. But everyone knows that, okay, that may have contributed, but where did it go? Disparity has increased enormously over the years, in the past 10 years. So the public discontent was this economic one on the one hand, that, okay, there is growth, but I'm not getting it. You are eating it up. This is the time that we have seen over the last couple of months. There have been some reports, say, for example, the former chief of police, who was the key figure ensuring fraudulent election in January 2024, that this person has enormous, gigantic amount of wealth, and many of them he has procured through extortion, kind of.
Yeah.
And then the U.S. government came up with imposing sanction on the former chief of army for the same reason, corruption. The tax officials, the reports started to come in. Everyone knew, but now here these are the documented ones. So the public discontent was, look, if the economy is growing, I'm not getting my share, but that's fine. I would have suffered with you if you were suffering. Then if you look at the banking sector, what happened is the bank, a non-performing loan, which is basically default. You take the money, you don't give it back. So that has been happening, skyrocketing over the last decade. Who is getting this money? They're connected to the regime. Then you have these projects, mega projects. You were mentioning you went there and saw all these roads and highways and this
no,
infrastructure.
it was a boom town when I was there, 12 years ago, especially like Chittagong and the outskirts of Dhaka. Yeah.
Because those mega projects, they call it mega projects, including Padma Bridge and others, those costs were going through roof because of the corruption, delayed completion of these things. And government over the years kept on borrowing money without taking into account that at some point they will have to pay it back. Pay it back means first you you don't pay the bank, just you have to pay the debt servicing. So debt servicing starting, non-performing loans starting, mega projects are becoming costly, price high, and in the energy sector, the small group of people are benefiting. All these things created an impression, rightfully so, that this government is not serving me. And if you add to that the political system, what happened is the authoritarian turn of this government since 2014. We saw three elections, 2014, 18, and 24. All of them were rigged is, I would say, a very modest way of describing it. So what happened is people cannot vote. Their right to vote has been practically taken away in the social media, in the cyber sphere, which impacted a large number of younger population. What we saw, they came out. They cannot speak because of the legal and extra-legal measures taken over the years that restricted their voices.
What you're describing, I mean, does sound like this perfect storm of economic distress, despite the fact that on paper, Bangladesh has done well over the years, endemic corruption, increasing authoritarianism on the part of Sheikh Hasina and her Awami League party, and just profound discontentment that now, and it seems as you describe it, this reinstatement of the quota system was really like a spark that lit a lot of these underlying forces that you're describing. And the government's apparently very heavy-handed response seems to have like exacerbated the crisis even further. So as things stand now, like how solid a footing is Sheikh Hasina and her Awami League on? Like this seems to be the strongest challenge to her rule in years. And as you said, it's not like something that the opposition is necessarily supporting. This is like seems to be organic.
It is organic. It has grown from the grassroots. As a matter of fact, the opposition now, Sheikh Hasina is targeting the opposition. She found an excuse to go heavy-handed. So the perfect storm, a combination of economic distress and political disenfranchisement, and a large pool of unemployed economically, with the despair, the younger population, all things came together and challenged the regime. And here, for Sheikh Hasina, she took it as a personal challenge because over the years it became a personalistic autocracy. She takes the credit of everything up. Economy is doing great. This is me. I am the one who have done it. And each and every time she always refers to I did it. I did it. So she took credit. And at this point, when it was challenged, she took it personally that is challenge to her. Challenge to her because that is what she has made. All the institutions are decimated. She is the only institution, so to speak, is standing there. So the challenge became a challenge to her. And government responded with the force. So much so, what happened over the last 4 or 5 days is unprecedented in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is not unknown to violence. I mean, it was born out of a violent war. Subsequently, Bangladeshi politics has always been very violent. Yet, what we witnessed is unprecedented, killing 170 plus people. And we don't know. We don't know because only today, as we speak, they are gradually lifting the internet restriction on internet. It was a complete blackout. So we didn't know that what happened outside Dhaka, what happened even within the Dhaka. People couldn't talk to themselves. They didn't know. Roughly 10 to 12 million Bangladeshis staying outside. They couldn't reach out to their families. And this is the situation. Now, where does it stand? What is the way forward, right?
Could this actually bring down Sheikh Hasina in some way? And how do you see the next few weeks playing out?
What I see Bangladesh stands at a crossroads today, in the sense that this government, which in my judgment since 2014 didn't have any moral legitimacy, it created a system that clientelist system, whereas patronage dispensation is the way they bought the loyalty of institutions such as the police and others. Here, what is indicated by Prime Minister when she met the business leaders, that she's going to be more hard. She's going to go after the opposition in a harder manner. Thereafter, we have seen the opposition leaders are being rounded up, arrested, and so on and so forth. So this is the one path.
Just like more crackdowns. See if you can like leverage your power in the government to just crack down and stifle this dissent. That's option A.
The option A, and that seems to be the one that is going on. And if that is the pathway, we don't know. We don't know because often that kind of repression eventually backfires in the sense that when people are pushed to the wall, they fight back. That brings us to the second option, that if currently, let's say today, it has subsided a little bit. Almost a week, there's been street, agitation, there's killing almost every day, all sorts of violence that we've seen. A little bit subsided. But now police is on the street, military is on the street, shoot on sight is there. The order, it has not been rescinded. The curfew has been relaxed a little bit, not in all places. What happens when people know about these things? Are they going to come out on the street again and create another kind of havoc? And if they persevere, then what will happen is the transition. How that transition would take place, I wish I had a crystal ball, I could say. But I don't see one thing. How could a government, after employing so much brute force and depending on this brute force, can sustain for a long time? Because so far, previously, the legitimation was that, okay, development is taking place. Now that legitimating ideology is gone. Nobody believes in that.
Yeah, like people would be like okay with the authoritarian turn if the pace of development had kept up, but it's slowing down now for like a variety of reasons. And so that kind of like unstated, political compact that Sheikh Hasina had with the people, I'll be your authoritarian, but I'll also deliver profound economic progress, that's eroding.
Right. It has a performance legitimacy. If that
Yeah.
that was their basis, that okay, you're having your food, so don't look at me, what am I doing kind of argument. But that is not happening. And the people have no option to express themselves. So their basic premise of staying in power after having these three elections, which are completely fraudulent, that we're delivering. Or the other thing was this legitimation idea that, okay, we are getting the ideals of the war of independence. They're not. Because in terms of the ideals of independence, the first and foremost was the democracy. Bangladesh emerged because the Pakistani rulers tried to rule the country with brute force. Bangladesh emerged because of a genocide which actually killed millions of people. So the legitimation ideas, these are gone now.
So I won't ask you to predict the future because you just told me you can't, and I'm a little disappointed. But you sketched out broadly two potential futures that you said Bangladesh might embrace. One is more crackdown, and Sheikh Hasina is able to like ride this out through brute force. The other is some sort of like political transition. What indicators will be looking towards what events will suggest to you which path is more likely?
If we look at the next days and weeks, at best weeks, I am not going to say into the months, what is the approach the government is taking, and whether their use of brute force, not only on the street, but in terms of rounding up people and using the judiciary, persecuting the opposition leaders as well as the students. And also, we'll see one barometer is this, which again bridges between the popular discontent and the student. When the students come back to the university, they cannot keep the universities closed forever, right? And the students are demanding that at this point, they say the quota issue is out of the way. We'll discuss about it. First, open the university, lift the curfew, take away this police and military from the street, and find out our friends who have disappeared, because out of these leaders they've disappeared completely. Some of them have disappeared.
So here in the United States, I mean, we've seen like a travel advisory being issued, but we really haven't seen, as far as I can tell, like a really like robust response yet from the United States, from other Western countries to the violence that is being meted out on the streets of Dhaka and elsewhere. What's going on with the Western response?
I'm disappointed to see that the countries which prior to the last election were speaking about democracy, they were insisting on the human rights issue. Now here's a blatant, gross violation of human rights, and their reactions are at best muted. These anodyne kind of statements, oh, we don't like violence, we're asking to restrain both parties. A state is perpetrating violence against its own citizens. Are there violence that has been perpetrated by the protesters? Of course, we have seen the violence and as well as destruction of property. But where it lies in this, what I described as a perfect storm, especially with respect to the political aspect. But I haven't seen the last 1 week that there is a robust reaction to this. This is the same countries which insisted. These are the same countries which know for sure that the election was, by their count, was not free and fair. So now, where do you go from here? I'm not suggesting that the Western countries would go and solve Bangladesh's problem. It cannot be. Nowhere they should go and solve the problem. Bangladeshis are trying to solve their problem. Unfortunately, they're facing a monumental task. And what are the democratic forces to step up? I understand India is not going to say, anything because they back this regime. I'm not expecting it from Beijing because they have their vested interest in Bangladesh and that region. I'm not expecting Mr. Putin to go to microphone and say, oh, we want democracy in Bangladesh. No, I don't. But what about the Western countries? The deafening silence to a great extent. I mean, what has come out is basically a very muted reaction from this. That is disappointing.
Ali, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. This was really helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.